On a winter evening in an English theater, a black woman bought a single ticket and took a seat in the front row. On the stage were two little girls, joined at the base of the spine, singing in two voices at once. The rest of the audience believed they were watching a curiosity billed as the two-headed nightingale, an oddity shipped over from America. The woman in the front row was watching her own daughters, taken from her years earlier, and carried across an ocean by men who owned them. When the children on the stage caught sight of her face in the crowd, the account says, she fainted where she sat. Her name was Monemia. The girls were Millie and Christine, and the story of how a mother came to be sitting in a foreign theater, buying a ticket to see her own stolen children perform, begins on a small farm in the pine country of eastern North Carolina. The place was Welch's Creek Township in Columbus County, near the town of Whiteville. In the middle of the 19th century, it was flat, sandy farmland, threaded with slow black water and stands of longleaf pine, the kind of country measured in cotton rows and in the distance to the nearest county road. Columbus County sat in the coastal plain of North Carolina, a region built on small and middling farms, rather than the grand plantations of the deep cotton South. Wealth there was counted in acres, in livestock, and in people. Under the law of the state, human beings could be owned, inventoried, mortgaged, and sold, and in the households of eastern North Carolina, that law shaped every ordinary day. An enslaved family lived with a particular kind of dread that free families did not. A husband could be sold away from a wife. A mother could be parted from a child at an auction block and never learn where the child had gone. That threat was not the exception in the enslaved South. It was the machinery of it. On one of those Columbus County farms lived a blacksmith and farmer named Jabez McKay. He worked the land and he worked a forge, and the people who did that work alongside him and for him were enslaved. Among them were a married couple, Jacob and Monemia McKoy, who took a version of their owner's name as enslaved people, so often were made to do. Jacob and Monemia had already built a family together. Before the summer of 1851, they had raised 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls, every one of them born in the ordinary way and of ordinary size and form. They knew what a birth was. They had lived through 7 of them. The 8th would be unlike anything the county had seen. To understand what that 8th birth would mean for the family, it helps to understand what was happening in American entertainment at the same moment. In the 1840s and 1850s, a new kind of business was spreading through the cities of the United States. It was the age of the dime museum and the traveling sideshow, of cabinets of so-called curiosities, where a paying public filed past living human beings, advertised as wonders of nature. The most famous of these operators was P.T. Barnum, whose American Museum in New York City drew enormous crowds to see attractions billed as marvels. In this trade, a human difference was not a private matter of a family. It was a commodity with a price, and the more unusual the difference, the higher the price climbed. North Carolina already knew this firsthand. Decades earlier, another pair of conjoined twins, Chang and Eng Bunker, had toured the world as a sensation and then settled down as farmers in Surry County, in the western part of the state. The idea that conjoined twins could be shown for money was not a rumor in North Carolina in 1851. It was a proven fortune waiting to be made. On the 11th of July, 1851, Monemia gave birth to twin daughters who were joined at the lower spine. Each girl had her own head, her own heart, her own 2 arms, and her own 2 legs. They shared a single pelvis, and they stood at an angle to each other, so that one faced slightly one way, and one faced slightly the other. The medical term for their condition was pygopagus, a word no one on that farm would have spoken. What the household saw was 2 healthy infant girls who could never be laid down apart, who would learn first to crawl and then to walk, in a kind of lifelong cooperation, each carrying part of the weight of the other for as long as they lived. One of the 2 was slightly smaller and would remain so. Her name was Millie. The larger was Christine. In the world Millie and Christine were born into, a child was never only a child. An enslaved infant was an asset, entered against an owner's name. But these 2 infants were more than an ordinary asset, and everyone who saw them understood it at once. In the language of the sideshow trade spreading across the country, the twins were a wonder, and a wonder could be shown. News of the birth moved through Columbus County within weeks. Curious neighbors began making their way up the road to the McKay farm to look at what the local talk called the two-headed child. What began as a trickle of visitors became a steady stream, and then a disruption to the working of the farm. The record indicates that Jabez McKay grew frustrated at the crowds tramping onto his land, and that in the same season he began to grasp what those crowds were telling him. People would travel to see the twins. People would pay to see the twins, and under the law, the twins were his. The machinery of sale began to turn before the girls could stand. When Millie and Christine were roughly 10 months old, McKay sold them for a sum recorded at around $1,000 to a man who intended to exhibit them. From that first transaction, the surviving record of who owned the sisters, and in what order, becomes genuinely tangled, and an honest account has to say so plainly rather than smooth it into a clean line. Different documents from the period name a South Carolina man called John Purvis, a showman remembered only as Brower, and a promoter styled as a professor named Millar. Some sources describe an initial lease rather than an outright sale, with a percentage of the exhibition earnings flowing back to McKay. What is consistent across every version is the shape of the thing. The twins would be taken from farm to town to city, and placed on display, and money would move back up the chain to the men who held the paper on them. One detail in that first arrangement is worth holding on to, because it becomes the thread that runs through everything that follows. Monemia, the mother, was for a time permitted to travel with her daughters. She was allowed to stay near the infants, not because anyone recognized any right of a mother to her children, but on the condition that she remained the property she had always been, and on the understanding that her presence kept the valuable girls calm and healthy. In the ledgers of the men who owned them, a mother's love was itself an asset, listed and valued like the children it protected. For a while, the arrangement held together. In October of 1853, when the twins were 2 years old, they were exhibited at the first official North Carolina State Fair. It was one of the largest public gatherings the young state had yet produced, drawing several thousand visitors on a single day. Among the livestock and the machinery and the produce competitions, on the fairgrounds of the state capitol, the two small children joined at the spine were shown to the crowds. When the fair closed, the path of the mother and the path of the daughters split. Monemia was sent back to the plantation where she was enslaved. The twins were carried onward toward the Gulf Coast and the larger markets of the exhibition trade, and the thin thread that had kept mother and children in the same place was cut. The men who controlled the twins took them to New Orleans, a city thick with commerce, spectacle, and money. There, local physicians were brought in to examine the girls and to certify to the paying public that the twins were genuinely joined and not some fraud of costume or trick of staging. This certification was a standing feature of the trade, and it would follow Millie and Christine for years. Because they were sold to the public as authentic, they were made to prove it over and over, to any physician or committee of curious men with the standing to demand it. Children were required to submit their own bodies to the inspection of strangers so that those strangers could satisfy themselves that the wonder was real. One period account describes the twins being exhibited in a manner meant to leave no room for doubt, which is a careful 19th century way of describing a violation of a child's privacy that the sisters would not fully escape until they were nearly grown. It was in New Orleans that the story turned dark in a new direction. In the churn of promissory notes, rival showmen, and speculative deals, in a trade where a set of conjoined children could be discussed as a $45,000 prospect, the twins became the object of a swindle. The man exhibiting them was reportedly cheated in a scheme built around the enormous sums the sisters could command. And in the confusion, Millie and Christine were kidnapped. They disappeared from public view entirely. For a stretch, the trail simply goes cold, and the children who had been the center of every crowd were suddenly nowhere that any member of the public, and no member of their family, could find them. When they surfaced again, in 1854, it was far to the north, in a museum in Philadelphia. The showman exhibiting them there styled himself Colonel John Wood, a man who had learned the trade in the orbit of the country's most famous impresario, and who would later run his own museum in Chicago. From Philadelphia, the girls were drawn into the orbit of that impresario directly. They were placed on display at P.T. Barnum's American Museum in New York City, the great 5-story cabinet of curiosities on Broadway, where enormous crowds paid to file past living people, advertised as marvels of nature. To the public streaming through those halls, Millie and Christine were simply a booked attraction among many. In truth, they were stolen children, hundreds of miles from a mother who did not know in which state, or eventually on which continent, they had been taken. And still the girls were moving. From New York, the men who controlled them carried the twins north into Canada, and from Canada across the Atlantic Ocean to England. By the time Millie and Christine reached the docks of Liverpool, they had been separated from their home in North Carolina for nearly the whole of their short lives. They were paraded through British towns and cities as a marvel imported from America. In Edinburgh, they were examined by Dr. James Simpson, the Scottish physician celebrated for discovering the anesthetic properties of chloroform, and one of the most respected medical men in Britain, brought in to pronounce upon 2 small girls who had been carried to his country against any will they were old enough to hold. The children, who could speak only the rough English they had picked up in showmen's wagons, were now a sensation, an entire ocean away from the farm where they were born, and from the woman who had borne them. The European tour was, in one sense, the height of the sisters' early fame, and in another, it was the deepening of the very thing that had shadowed them since New Orleans. Everywhere the twins were shown, the physicians of the region were invited to inspect them, so that the wonder could be certified anew for each fresh audience. In city after British and continental city, learned men in dark coats were brought before 2 small children to look and to measure and to pronounce. The examinations were framed as science, and some of the men who conducted them were genuinely eminent, but for the girls at the center of the room the experience was the same, regardless of the credentials on the far side of the table. They were made to submit their bodies to strangers on command. What the medical journals of Europe recorded as observations of a remarkable case were, for Millie and Christine, ordinary days in a childhood spent being handled and looked at by men they had never met, in countries whose languages they were only beginning to learn. The record that survives from those years is largely the record those observers left behind, which is to say, the story of the girls' own childhood comes down to us mostly in the words of the people examining them, and almost never in their own. That woman had never stopped looking. If you are finding this account worth your time, consider subscribing, so the ledger stays open and forgotten cases like this one keep being told from the documents up. The record of what Monemia did next is one of the reasons this story survived at all. Back in North Carolina, the tangled chain of ownership had finally come to rest on one man. His name was Joseph Pearson Smith, a merchant connected to the town of Wadesboro in Anson County, in the state's southern Piedmont. Through a series of deals and promissory notes, Smith had become the twins' legal owner. Whatever else may be said of a man who bought and owned children, Smith wanted the children he had paid for, and by some accounts he had paid an extraordinary sum, with one archival source citing a figure as high as $30,000 for the pair. That number, whatever its exact accuracy, measures how valuable the exhibition trade believed the sisters to be. When the showman entrusted with the twins stole them away and vanished with them overseas, Smith had every commercial reason to give chase. Monemia had a reason that had nothing to do with commerce. The pursuit took years. Accounts describe a search stretching across roughly 3 years, with the trail of the twins traced out of New Orleans, across the Atlantic, up into Scotland, and finally into England. A detective was engaged to follow it. And when the search at last closed in on the girls in Britain, Joseph Smith did not sail alone to recover his property. He brought Monemia with him. The enslaved mother of the stolen twins crossed an entire ocean at the side of the man who owned her, for the single purpose of standing in front of her daughters again. The reunion, as it comes down through the record, took place in a theater. Millie and Christine, by then roughly 5 or 6 years old, were scheduled to perform. Monemia, together with Smith and the detective, bought tickets to the performance like ordinary members of the paying public and took seats near the front. Historians who have studied the case describe the moment plainly. Monemia sat in the front row of a show advertised as a curiosity, and when she was at last reunited with the daughters who had been carried away from her, when the little girls on the stage recognized the face of their own mother in the crowd, she fainted. It is one of the few moments in the entire account where the sources let us see the mother rather than the wonder, and it repays sitting with. A woman who had been told that her love was an asset, had spent years turning that love into an engine, and had ridden it across an ocean to a stranger's theater to find her own children. What followed moved into a courtroom. Smith sued in the English courts to regain custody of the twins, and the case turned in part on Monemia herself. The twins later described the trial in the account they published under their own authority, and they credited the outcome to their mother. It was, in their telling, the plain and evident tenderness Monemia showed toward them, her unmistakable bond with the two children she cradled as her little ones, that persuaded the court where the girls truly belonged. Smith won the suit. The sisters and their mother returned to North Carolina. Along the way, while the party was still touring in Britain, Monemia gave birth to another daughter, a child named Elvie, so that the family that recrossed the Atlantic was larger than the one that had set out. They came home to Wadesboro, where Smith had relocated the whole McKoy family, so that Jacob, Monemia, and the twins' brothers and sisters were together again on his land. For the McKoy family, this remained bondage. Every one of them, apart from the two famous girls whose value set them slightly apart, was still enslaved and worked as enslaved people worked. But the daughters had been recovered from across an ocean, and for the first time in their lives, Millie and Christine settled into something that resembled a stable household with the mother who had crossed the world to reclaim them. It was in that household that the second half of the sisters' story became possible, and the instrument of it was Smith's wife, Mary. Where the wider world had wanted the twins only as bodies to be shown and certified, Mary Smith set about treating them as children to be raised and taught. She taught the girls to read and to write. She taught them the piano. She trained their two voices, and it was found that the sisters could sing in genuine harmony with one another, Millie carrying the lower alto line and Christine the higher soprano, so that two distinct parts rose together from what the public insisted on calling a single creature. Mary Smith taught them to dance in their careful, cooperative way, and she taught them languages, until in time, the sisters could recite and hold conversation in several tongues, French and German among them, with the record eventually crediting them with a working command of as many as 5 languages. The sisters credited Mrs. Smith not only with their education but with their Christian faith, and in their own writings they described a devotion to her modeled openly on the biblical bond of Ruth and Naomi, saying that where she went, they would go, and where she stayed, they would stay. The transformation changed the terms of the sisters' exhibition, though it did not end it. The girls who had once been shown as a raw medical curiosity, a thing to be examined and certified in city after city, were now presented as accomplished young performers. The billing changed with them. They became the Carolina Twins, and then, most lastingly, the Two-Headed Nightingale, a name that placed their singing at the center rather than their bodies. Audiences who arrived expecting to gawk at an oddity found themselves listening to two educated young women perform in close harmony and answer questions put to them in French and German. Then the country the sisters lived in tore itself apart. The Civil War came, and with it the collapse of the entire world that had defined every day of their lives. During the war years, the twins were kept out of sight for their own safety, hidden away in the upcountry near Spartanburg, in South Carolina, to keep them from being seized amid the disorder of a country at war with itself. A valuable and famous pair of enslaved girls was, in wartime, a target for anyone bold enough to take them, and so for a stretch of years the Two-Headed Nightingale fell silent and out of view. In 1862, before the fighting ended, Joseph Pearson Smith died. The man who had owned the twins, chased them across an ocean, and given them into his wife's teaching was gone, and his estate, which included dozens of enslaved people, passed into the hands of his widow, Mary, and then slavery itself ended. The Emancipation Proclamation and the close of the war accomplished for Millie and Christine what no English court ever had. It made them, for the first time in their lives, not property. No promissory note, no bill of sale, no lease agreement, no ledger entry could ever be drawn against them again. They were two young women, free, educated, fluent in several languages, and in possession of a talent that had already carried them around the world before they were old enough to consent to any of it. What the sisters did with that freedom is the quiet heart of the whole story. They stayed. Millie and Christine chose to remain with Mary Smith and to continue performing, now on terms that were, for the first time, partly their own. The forced physical examinations that had shadowed their childhood were set behind them by their own condition, a line the grown women drew and held. The money they earned was now money they had a genuine claim to. They went back out into the world as performers who had agreed to be seen, rather than as children who had been shown against their will. The scale of what followed is difficult to overstate for two people who had entered the world as the property of a country blacksmith. Managed now by the Smith family, and increasingly on their own account, the twins toured across the United States and through Europe for the better part of 30 years. They appeared with the largest traveling shows in America, including the great circus operation that carried the Barnum name. The reach of those tours is preserved in the record city by city. In the years just after the war, the sisters performed in Baltimore, in Washington, in Philadelphia, and in New York, where they once again appeared at Barnum's museum, this time not as stolen children, but as a headline act. They toured New England in 1869, moving through Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Maine. In 1870, they carried the show west and south through the growing country, into Pennsylvania and Ohio, Indiana and Kansas and Nebraska. On those bills, they stood alongside the other famous performers of the exhibition age. They shared platforms with the towering Nova Scotia giantess Anna Swan, and with the man billed as the tallest in the world, and at times they traveled in the company of Chang and Eng Bunker, the older conjoined twins from the western part of their own home state, whose long careers and quiet retirement to a North Carolina farm had helped make the sisters' own fortunes imaginable in the first place. The trade that had once carried Millie and Christine off as property had become, in freedom, the trade they worked on their own terms. Reports from the period described the sisters earning as much as $600 in a single week at the height of their fame, an astonishing sum in the years after the war, when a laborer might work the better part of a year to earn a fraction of it. In 1869, the sisters published an autobiography, sold at their appearances, in which they spoke for themselves, in their own arranged words, about who and what they were. Bound into that same little book were letters from physicians who had examined them, including a group of 5 Philadelphia doctors, who certified in writing that the sisters' joined anatomy was genuine and no hoax. The very authentication that had once been forced upon 2 frightened children was now folded into a book the grown women sold on their own behalf. And in the summer of 1871, they were invited to Buckingham Palace, where Queen Victoria received the 2 women who had been born enslaved in a North Carolina cabin, watched them perform, and presented them with a gift of diamonds. The girls who had once been carried through Britain as stolen curiosities returned to it as honored guests of its queen. Through all of it, across every stage and in every language, the sisters held to one answer about themselves, and it is the answer that gives this entire story its spine. For their whole lives, physicians, showmen, and crowds had treated Millie and Christine as a problem to be solved and a question to be settled. Were they one person or 2? Could they be surgically separated? Ought they to be? The sisters answered the question directly, in their own written words, in the account published under their own authority. They wrote that although they spoke of themselves in the plural, they felt as but one person, and had always been so regarded, even while bearing the 2 names Millie and Christine. And then they wrote the thing that the surgeons and the promoters and the curious crowds could not argue away. They wrote that they would not wish to be severed, even if science could effect a separation, because they had, in their own account, one heart, one feeling in common, one desire, one purpose. The whole world had spent decades trying to decide whether they were one or whether they were 2. The sisters had already decided for themselves, and their decision was that they would not be parted, by any hand, for any reason. They lived the rest of that answer out on the exact ground where it began. As their fame settled in the 1880s, and their health began to slow them, Millie and Christine turned toward home. The family had already used the money the twins earned to buy back the very land the sisters were born on, the old McKay property in Columbus County. so that the people who had once been sold off that soil now held its deed. The sisters built a house there and gathered their parents and siblings under its roof. The children who had been carried off before they could walk had purchased the earth their mother had labored on in bondage and had returned it to their family as free people who owned it outright. They did not keep it all for themselves. Through their working years and on into their retirement, Millie and Christine gave steadily and deliberately to the institutions that newly freed Black communities were building across the South. In the decades after emancipation, formerly enslaved people across the region were pouring what little they had into the two things slavery had most denied them, which were schooling and a church of their own. Building a schoolhouse for Black children in the rural South of that era was slow, costly, and often dangerous work, resisted at every turn, and funded penny by penny out of communities that owned almost nothing. Into that effort, the sisters put real money. They funded Black schools. They supported Black churches. The two women who had spent their own childhoods as a spectacle for paying strangers spent the last decades of their lives quietly financing the ordinary machinery of freedom for people who had begun exactly where they had begun, and who had come out of slavery with none of the fame or the earnings that had, in the end, set the sisters apart. The end came in the autumn of 1912. The sisters were 61 years old, and both had contracted tuberculosis, the slow wasting disease that filled the cemeteries of that era. It took them within hours of each other, in the order that a lifetime joined had made almost inevitable. Millie died first. Christine survived her sister for something on the order of half a day, alone at last in the body the two of them had always shared, and the physicians attending her administered morphine to ease the hours she had left. On the 8th of October 1912, Christine followed Millie out of the world. The single soul the sisters had always insisted upon had, in the end, refused to be divided even by death for longer than one night. They were buried together on the land in Columbus County, at first in graves that carried no marker at all. For decades, two women who had performed for a queen and dined on their own earnings lay in unmarked ground. It was not until 1969, more than half a century after their deaths, that the sisters were moved to a cemetery near Whiteville and given a stone at last. The words carved into it did not try to resolve the question that had chased Millie and Christine through every day of their lives. The words simply stated the truth the sisters themselves had always claimed: a soul with two thoughts, two hearts that beat as one. The historical record leaves a great deal unsaid, and the honest thing is to name the silence rather than fill it. The record does not tell us what Millie and Christine felt during the years they were hidden away from the war, or what passed between them in the private language two people share when they have never once, in an entire lifetime, been alone. It does not preserve most of their own words, because most of their words were never written down, and the account that survives was shaped for a paying audience. What the record does hold is enough to carry the weight of the story. It holds the bills of sale that once made them property. It holds the accounts of a mother who crossed an ocean and fainted at the sight of them in a foreign theater. It holds the sisters' own published insistence that they were one soul that would not be parted. And it holds a deed showing that the ground they were born enslaved upon became, before the end, ground that they owned.